In the autumn of 1914, if you were a British merchant captain in the Indian Ocean, the worst thing that could happen to you on any given morning was to look towards the horizon and see a single funnel where your lookout had reported 4. By the time the mistake was recognized, it was generally too late to do anything meaningful about it. The ship bearing down on you would be a light cruiser of approximately 3,500 tons, traveling at 24 knots, flying no flag until she was close enough that flying a flag would no longer serve any tactical purpose. Then she would hoist the Imperial German Navy ensign, run out her guns, and fire a warning shot across your bow. If you were a British merchant captain with any operational sense at all, you stopped your ship at that point. What happened next was, by the standards of naval commerce raiding throughout all of recorded history, genuinely and almost inexplicably unusual. The boarding party that came across from the German cruiser was courteous. The German officers were correct in their behavior and occasionally apologetic in their manner. Your crew was not harmed. Your personal possessions were not taken. Your passengers, if you had any, were treated with consideration. The cargo was assessed, and if it was of military value, it was removed or destroyed. The ship herself was sunk. Or if a neutral vessel was available to receive them, your crew was transferred to it with their personal effects and a formal receipt for whatever had been taken. You were, in the specific vocabulary of prize law and the laws of naval warfare, a prisoner, and then you were released, and the German cruiser turned away to find its next target. The ship was the SMS Emden. The officer who had established the standards of conduct that made these encounters so different from what commerce raiding had historically meant was Kapitänleutnant Karl Friedrich Max von Müller, her commanding officer, 35 years old in 1914, a Hanoverian of aristocratic background who had entered the Imperial German Navy as a cadet at the age of 16 and had risen through the officer corps with the combination of professional competence and personal dignity that defined his conduct during the 3 months of raiding that made him the most celebrated naval officer of the early war. The Emden's cruise lasted from August of 1914 to November of 1914. In that time, she sank or captured 30 merchant ships totaling approximately 70,000 tons of cargo capacity, bombarded the oil storage facilities at Madras on the Bay of Bengal, conducted a daring raid on the British naval base at Penang in the Strait of Malacca, and kept the entire Allied naval establishment in the Indian Ocean in a state of sustained anxiety that required the diversion of approximately 78 Allied warships to the hunt for a single German cruiser. She did all of this while maintaining a standard of treatment for prisoners and captured crews that was so far above what international law required and so far above what the psychology of naval warfare might have predicted that it became, in the press coverage of both sides, the central fact about the Emden rather than a footnote to her tactical accomplishments. Von Müller's reputation as a gentleman raider was not a propaganda construction applied after the fact to a story that the circumstances had made convenient. It was the product of deliberate choices made under operational conditions that offered him other options and in which the other options would have been militarily defensible. He chose to treat prisoners well not because he was required to, but because he had concluded that it was the right thing to do, and because the specific form of naval warfare he was conducting depended on maintaining a kind of moral credibility that indiscriminate violence would have destroyed. That the two motivations aligned was fortunate. That the moral motivation was primary is suggested by the consistency with which von Müller's standards were applied, even in circumstances where the military justification for them was weak or absent. To understand what the Emden was doing in the Indian Ocean in 1914, it is necessary to understand the strategic situation from which her crews emerged and the specific nature of the commerce raiding mission that von Müller had been assigned. The Emden was a member of the German East Asia Squadron, the naval force stationed at Tsingtao on the Chinese coast that was the principal instrument of German naval power in the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions in the years before the war. The East Asia Squadron was commanded by Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, and it consisted of the armoured cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the light cruisers Emden, Nuremberg and Leipzig, with several smaller vessels and auxiliary craft. When war broke out in August of 1914, von Spee's squadron faced a strategic situation that offered no good options. The squadron was too small to seriously challenge the combined Allied naval forces in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, and it was too far from Germany to return home without crossing oceans controlled by those same Allied forces. Von Spee's decision was to take his main force east across the Pacific, attempting to reach the Atlantic and eventually return to Germany or to operate against Allied shipping in the Western Hemisphere. The decision was strategically sound as far as it went, and would culminate in the Battle of Coronel, where von Spee's cruisers sank 2 British armoured cruisers off the coast of Chile, and then in the Battle of the Falkland Islands, where the Royal Navy's response destroyed the East Asia Squadron with the loss of all 5 German warships and nearly 2,000 men, including von Spee himself and his 2 sons. Before von Spee turned east, he summoned von Müller aboard his flagship and offered him a choice. The Emden could accompany the squadron on its eastward voyage, adding her modest combat power to the force and sharing whatever fate the squadron encountered. Or she could detach and operate independently in the Indian Ocean, conducting commerce raiding against British and Allied shipping in a theatre where the German naval presence had been essentially eliminated by the outbreak of war, and where, consequently, the disruption that a single capable warship could create was potentially enormous. Von Müller chose the independent operation. It was the right decision from a military standpoint, and von Spee, who understood the situation as clearly as anyone, concurred in it. The Indian Ocean in August of 1914 was one of the most important maritime highways in the British imperial system. The trade routes running from Australasia to Europe, from India to the Persian Gulf, from East Africa to the subcontinent, all converged on the Indian Ocean and passed through waters that were patrolled, if at all, by Allied warships whose primary concern in the weeks after the outbreak of war was the German East Asia Squadron, rather than a detached light cruiser operating independently. The Emden herself was a ship of the Dresden class, completed in 1909 and representing a type of warship that had been designed for exactly the kind of independent operations that von Müller was now undertaking. She displaced 3,652 tons at standard load, measured 118 meters in length, and was driven by 2 sets of triple expansion steam engines producing 13,700 shaft horsepower through twin screws. This gave her a maximum speed of approximately 24 knots, adequate to run down any merchant vessel she was likely to encounter, and sufficient to escape most of the cruisers that might be sent to catch her, though not sufficient to outrun the modern British light cruisers that would eventually be assigned to the hunt. Her armament consisted of 10 10.5-centimeter guns in individual mounts along her sides, 4 torpedo tubes, and a crew of approximately 360 officers and men. She was not a powerful warship by the standards of the large armoured cruisers and battleships that were being built in that period. She was precisely the kind of ship that was most useful for the mission von Müller had accepted, fast enough to catch anything she needed to catch, small enough to move inconspicuously in the shipping lanes, and armed enough to compel compliance from any merchant vessel she encountered without the need to close to ranges that would put her crew at risk. The false funnel was von Müller's most distinctive tactical innovation. The Emden had 3 funnels, which was visible enough at any reasonable distance to allow a British merchant captain or naval lookout to identify her as a German light cruiser and take whatever action remained available. The British light cruisers of the Town class that were assigned to patrol the Indian Ocean had 4 funnels, a configuration that was distinctive at distance. By constructing a dummy 4th funnel from canvas and wood and stepping it in position when approaching a potential target, von Müller made his ship resemble, at casual observation distance, a British Town-class cruiser rather than a German raider. The deception worked repeatedly, because merchant captains who saw what appeared to be a British naval vessel approaching them had no reason to take evasive action, and by the time the funnel count or the lines of the ship resolved the ambiguity, they were already within gun range. The first captures came in early September of 1914 as the Emden moved into the Bay of Bengal and found the shipping lanes crowded with vessels that had not yet adjusted their operations to account for the presence of a German raider in their waters. Von Müller's procedure was consistent throughout the cruise. He stopped the vessel, sent a boarding party to assess the cargo, determined whether it constituted contraband under prize law, and then decided whether to sink the ship, take it as a prize, or release it. The treatment of the cruise was invariably correct. Personal possessions were left untouched. Passengers were treated with particular consideration. Officers were addressed with the formalities appropriate to their rank and position. The neutrals he encountered were released outright after their papers were inspected. British vessels carrying non-military cargo were sunk or taken, with the crews transferred to neutral vessels that von Müller accumulated for the purpose of receiving prisoners before releasing them to make their way to the nearest port. He was scrupulous about issuing receipts for cargo and property taken, a practice that had no military utility whatsoever, and that reflected the specific legal framework of prize law that von Müller had internalized as genuinely binding on his conduct, rather than as an inconvenient formality to be acknowledged and ignored. The capture that most clearly illustrated the character of von Müller's operation was the Greek steamer Pontoporos in early September. The Pontoporos was carrying a cargo of coal that the Emden needed, because a warship operating independently for extended periods in waters where no friendly port existed required a continuous supply of fuel that could only be obtained by intercepting colliers or by using captured vessels as floating fuel depots. The Pontoporos was a neutral vessel, which made her capture under prize law problematic, but her cargo of coal was military contraband destined for Allied use. Von Müller retained the vessel and its cargo as a prize, treating the Greek crew with complete correctness throughout the weeks that the Pontoporos sailed in company with the Emden as a supply vessel. When the arrangement was no longer operationally useful, the Pontoporos was released with her crew unharmed and with compensation offered for the time and the cargo. The coal problem was a persistent and fundamental operational constraint throughout the cruise. The Emden burned approximately 200 tons of coal per day at cruising speed, and she could carry approximately 900 tons in her bunkers, giving her an unreplenished range of approximately 5,000 nautical miles at economical speed. Independent operations in the Indian Ocean required either access to a coaling station, which the Germans did not possess after the outbreak of war, or the continuous capture of colliers and coal-carrying merchantmen that could be used to replenish the Emden's bunkers at sea. Von Müller became expert at the operational mathematics of coaling, timing his captures and his fuel state with a precision that kept the Emden operational when her enemies might have reasonably expected her fuel situation to force her to seek a neutral port and in-turn. The bombardment of Madras on the evening of September 22, 1914, was the most dramatically visible action of the entire cruise and the one that most clearly illustrated both von Müller's tactical boldness and the specific limits he placed on that boldness. The Emden arrived off the Indian coast after dark, approached the harbour entrance, and opened fire on the large fuel oil storage tanks of the Burma Oil Company that were visible against the darkening sky. The tanks caught fire and burned spectacularly, producing a conflagration that was visible for miles and that caused panic in the city. The psychological effect on the Indian population and on the British colonial administration was substantial and considerably disproportionate to the actual physical damage caused. What is historically significant about the Madras bombardment is what von Müller did not do. The city of Madras itself, with its population of several 100,000 people, its commercial district, its residential areas, and its colonial administration buildings, was entirely within the range of the Emden's guns. A commander willing to conduct unrestricted bombardment could have caused enormous damage and a great many civilian casualties. Von Müller fired specifically and exclusively at the oil storage facilities, military and commercial infrastructure of direct utility to the British war effort, and then withdrew before dawn. No residential areas were hit. No civilian deaths were recorded from the bombardment itself, though the fires produced some casualties from panic and from the secondary effects of the burning oil. The decision was deliberate. Von Müller had thought through the ethics of bombardment as a form of naval warfare and had reached conclusions that were more restrictive than international law required. He was entitled, under the laws of naval warfare as they existed in 1914, to bombard defended ports and their facilities. He chose to limit his bombardment to specifically military and industrial targets, and to avoid civilian areas, even when doing so reduced the operational effect of the attack. The oil tanks would have been worth far less as a strategic target than the colonial administration buildings and the commercial district, but the latter contained people, and von Müller was not in the business of killing civilians. The raid on Penang on October 28, 1914, was perhaps the most audacious tactical operation of the cruise and the one that most clearly demonstrated the Emden's military effectiveness when employed against naval rather than merchant targets. Penang, on the northwestern coast of Malaya, was a British colonial port that served as a base for Allied naval forces operating in the Strait of Malacca. The harbour contained, on the morning of October 28th, the Russian protected cruiser Jemchug and the French destroyer Mousquet, among other Allied vessels. Von Müller entered the harbour flying the British naval ensign, a deception that was not explicitly prohibited by the laws of war, provided that the attacker displayed his true flag before opening fire. He did. At the last possible moment before engagement range, the Emden struck the British ensign and hoisted the German naval flag. She then fired 2 torpedoes at the Jemchug and several salvos from her 10.5-centimeter guns. The Jemchug was struck by both torpedoes and sank in the harbour. The French destroyer Mousquet, which sorted to engage the Emden as she was withdrawing, was sunk by gunfire. The casualties among the Allied crews were significant. Approximately 190 men killed and wounded between the two vessels. Von Müller's response to those casualties was characteristic. The survivors from both vessels, who could be recovered from the water, were taken aboard the Emden, given medical treatment for their wounds, and transferred to a neutral vessel as quickly as operational circumstances permitted. The medical officer of the Emden, Oberleutnant zur See Dr. Langerhans, treated wounded Russian and French sailors with the same care he gave to the Emden's own casualties, which was the standard that von Müller expected and that the crew maintained. The pursuit of the Emden by Allied warships throughout the autumn of 1914 was an immense and embarrassing operation that stretched the resources of the Royal Navy and the navies of its allies, at a moment when those resources were being stretched in every direction by the demands of a war that was turning out to be far more extensive and far more costly than anyone had predicted. The 78 Allied warships that were at various times assigned to the hunt for a single German light cruiser represented a diversion of force that had strategic implications beyond the direct damage the Emden was causing to Allied shipping. The insurance rates for ships operating in the Indian Ocean rose dramatically. Indian ports experienced disruptions as shipping companies altered their routes to avoid the areas where the Emden had been reported. The psychological effect on the Indian population of an enemy cruiser operating apparently at will in the Bay of Bengal contributed to anxieties about the security of British imperial power that the colonial administration found difficult to manage. The end came at the Cocos Islands, a British cable and wireless station in the eastern Indian Ocean, on November 9, 1914. Von Müller had decided to destroy the wireless station and the undersea telegraph cables that ran through the Cocos Islands, which were an important node in the British communications network, linking Australia to India and to the Western world. He sent a landing party of approximately 50 men ashore under the command of Lieutenant Helmuth von Mucke to destroy the facilities. The wireless operator on Direction Island, one of the Cocos group, managed to send a distress signal before the German landing party reached the station. The signal was received by the Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney, which was escorting a large convoy of Australian and New Zealand troops transiting the Indian Ocean as part of the reinforcement of the Allied armies in Europe. The Sydney turned away from the convoy and made for the Cocos Islands at maximum speed. The Sydney was a significantly more capable warship than the Emden in almost every tactical dimension. She displaced 5,400 tons, compared to the Emden's 3,652 tons. She mounted 8 6-inch guns, compared to the Emden's 10 10.5-centimeter pieces, a meaningful difference in the weight of shot and the destructive power of each hit. She made 25.5 knots, slightly faster than the Emden's maximum speed. The tactical outcome of an engagement between a fresh ship of superior capability and a ship that had been operating continuously for 3 months without access to a dockyard, burning whatever coal she could capture, and crewed by men who had not had meaningful shore leave since leaving Tsingtao, was not genuinely in doubt. The battle lasted approximately 90 minutes. The Sydney's 6-inch shells outranged the Emden's 10.5-centimeter guns at the ranges at which the engagement was initially fought, allowing the Australian cruiser to strike the Emden repeatedly before the German ship could effectively respond. The Emden's engine room was destroyed early in the action, reducing her speed and maneuverability. Her forward fire control was knocked out. Fires broke out in multiple locations. The crew, exhausted from 3 months of continuous operations, fought with a determination that the Sydney's captain would later document in his official report as impressive in the face of obviously overwhelming circumstances. Von Müller, with his ship on fire, barely able to move, and taking hits at a rate that was killing his crew without any corresponding effect on the Sydney, made the decision to beach the Emden on North Keeling Island, rather than allow her to sink in deep water with the survivors still aboard. He ran the Emden onto the reef at the northern end of the island at approximately 1100 hours on November 9th. The Sydney ceased fire when the Emden's ensign came down, initially interpreting this as a surrender, but reopened fire when it appeared the ensign had been struck to allow damage control work, and not as a formal signal of surrender. The confusion was eventually resolved, and the Sydney stood off while von Müller and his surviving crew remained aboard the wrecked Emden, tending their wounded, burying their dead, and waiting. The butcher's bill was severe. Of the Emden's crew of 360 officers and men at the start of the cruise, 134 had been killed in the battle with the Sydney. A further 65 were wounded, many seriously. Von Müller himself was unwounded. He was taken prisoner with his surviving crew and treated by the Sydney's captain, John Glossop, with a correctness that deliberately mirrored the treatment von Müller had extended to his own prisoners throughout the 3 months of the cruise. Glossop had been thoroughly briefed on the Emden's record, and his treatment of von Müller reflected both professional respect and a specific awareness that the man he was taking prisoner had conducted himself throughout the cruise in a manner that obligated a reciprocal decency. The landing party that had been sent ashore at Direction Island under Helmuth von Mucke was not captured. By the time the Sydney returned to Direction Island after dealing with the beached Emden, von Mucke had commandeered a small sailing schooner, the Asia, and taken his 50 men to sea. What followed over the subsequent months was an odyssey of remarkable audacity and endurance that brought von Mucke and his men through the Red Sea and across the Arabian Peninsula to Constantinople. A journey that took 5 months, required multiple changes of transport, and involved engagements with Arab forces and considerable hardship from the environment. Von Mucke and all but a handful of his men eventually reached Germany, where their escape was celebrated alongside the Emden's crews as evidence of the individual qualities of Imperial German naval officers. The Aisha herself, the captured sailing schooner that began the escape, became a minor legend of the naval war. Von Müller spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of the British, initially at Malta and later at a prisoner of war camp in England. His treatment by his captors was generally correct, though he experienced the frustrations and indignities that imprisonment in wartime always involves. His health, which had been affected by the sustained strain of the cruise and by the battle itself, was not good. He was repatriated to Germany after the armistice in November of 1918 and returned to a country that had lost the war and was in the process of the social and political upheaval that accompanied defeat. The reception he received in Germany was extraordinary by any measure. He was celebrated not merely as a successful naval officer, but as an exemplar of a kind of conduct in war that the German public, in the specific psychological moment of November 1918, needed to believe was possible and representative. Germany had lost a war in which its military forces had been accused of systematic atrocities: the invasion of Belgium, the bombardment of civilian towns, the unrestricted submarine warfare that had been declared illegal by international law and that had killed thousands of neutral and civilian sailors. Against this record, von Müller's cruise stood as evidence that the German military was capable of fighting according to rules, of treating enemies with dignity, of maintaining standards that the imperial tradition at its best had always claimed to represent. The Kaiser Wilhelm Prize, the highest decoration the Imperial German Navy could award, was given to von Müller in a ceremony that was, given the circumstances of November 1918, simultaneously a recognition of genuine achievement and an act of institutional self-definition by a navy that was about to cease to exist. Von Müller accepted the decoration with the same quiet dignity that he had brought to everything else in his naval career. He died on March 9, 1923, at the age of 44, of the accumulated effects of the illness that had been affecting him since his time as a prisoner. He had not lived long enough to see what Germany would become in the decade that followed his death, and it is impossible to know what he would have made of a regime that claimed the nationalist tradition he had embodied while systematically destroying everything that tradition had represented at its best. The Emden herself remained on the reef at North Keeling Island, where she was eventually broken up by salvage operations in the 1920s. The reef itself, subsequently renamed in various charts and references, has been protected as a natural marine environment, and the coral growth of more than a century has covered and incorporated the remnants of the wreck into the reef ecosystem in ways that make the two difficult to separate. Nothing visible above the waterline remains. The legacy of the Emden's cruise has been examined from several different perspectives in the century since it occurred, and the perspectives do not entirely agree about what the legacy means. The operational assessment is relatively straightforward. 3 months of successful commerce raiding by a single light cruiser, 30 ships captured or sunk, a diversion of 78 Allied warships, and a psychological impact on British imperial commerce and confidence that was disproportionate to the physical damage caused. These are the military facts, and they support the conclusion that the cruise was one of the most effective independent naval operations of the First World War. The ethical assessment is more complicated and more interesting. Von Müller's treatment of prisoners was not merely unusual for the context of naval warfare in 1914. It was unusual for the context of warfare in any period, reflecting a standard of conduct that most military commanders across most of history would have acknowledged as admirable in principle while finding various reasons to fall short of in practice. He had the means to be cruel and the military circumstances to justify it, and he chose not to be. The choice was not strategically optimal in every case, as allowing survivors from sunken ships to reach port and report the Emden's position and intentions was a direct operational cost. He made the choice anyway, consistently, and without apparent internal debate about whether the circumstances justified an exception. The question that the Emden's history ultimately poses is not whether von Müller was an admirable man, because the evidence that he was is substantially beyond reasonable dispute. The question is what his admirability tells us about the nature of the standards he embodied, and whether those standards were the product of individual character, professional culture, class background, the specific circumstances of his mission, or some combination of all these factors. The answer matters because it determines whether the standards can be generalized, can be taught, can be institutionalized, and can survive the kinds of institutional pressure that wartime inevitably generates. The evidence suggests that von Müller's conduct was the product of individual character operating within a professional culture that supported but did not guarantee his specific choices. The Imperial German Navy produced other officers whose conduct under similar circumstances was not comparable to von Müller's. The unrestricted submarine campaign that Germany declared in February of 1915, 3 months after the Emden's final battle, was a deliberate choice to treat civilian neutral shipping as a legitimate military target, killing thousands of sailors and passengers whose ships happened to be in British-controlled waters. The same Navy that decorated von Müller for his humanitarian treatment of prisoners conducted a submarine campaign that was, by any reasonable interpretation of the laws of war, a systematic violation of the obligations those laws imposed. Von Müller's example was not sufficient to define the conduct of the institution he served. It was sufficient to define the conduct of the ship he commanded for 3 months of the autumn of 1914. Within those limits, it was an example that has remained in the memory of naval history, precisely because the limits it placed on the means of warfare were maintained under conditions where they did not need to be, by a man who appears to have maintained them because he genuinely believed they were right. The British sailors and merchant seamen who were captured and released by the Emden, who received receipts for their confiscated property, and were treated with the formality appropriate to their rank and the courtesy appropriate to their person, generally spoke of von Müller with a respect that had no parallel in the usual relations between captor and prisoner. Some of them wrote accounts of their experiences that were published during the war, and that contributed to the specific character of the Emden's legend as it developed in the Allied countries as well as in Germany. The legend, unusually, was the same legend in both. A German naval officer who captured and sank British ships while treating their crews with scrupulous correctness earned the respect of the enemies he had defeated, and that respect was documented while the war was still being fought, and remained in the historical record long after the war was over. That is the legacy of the Emden's crews, not merely the tonnage sunk, or the warships diverted, or the insurance premiums raised, but the demonstration that the rules of war could be followed by a man who was good at his job in circumstances that offered him every opportunity to disregard them, and that following them was entirely compatible with military effectiveness. The demonstration was made once, by one man, in 3 months of 1914, in the Indian Ocean. It has not been forgotten, which is perhaps the most important thing that can be said about it.